And now, please welcome ExcelinEd CEO, Patricia Levesque.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you will join me for a short moment of silence for the Bush family. Thank you. Well, welcome to the 2018 National Summit on Education Reform. We are so glad that you joined us here in our nation's capital. This year, again, we have more than 1,000 attendees from 47 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. We're so excited to spend the next 2 days with you. You're here because you believe each and every child matters. You believe that a high-quality education makes a difference in the future for these children, and you believe that policy changes lives. Well, I believe that too. Yet, we know that believing is just step one, right? Step two is taking action, and that's why you're here. You're going to spend the next 2 days learning from each other, hearing from seasoned experts, and gathering great ideas to act upon when you get home, because our children cannot wait. So to help me open this year's National Summit, it's my pleasure to introduce to you a group of students from Eagle Academy Public Charter School here in Washington, D.C. Eagle Academy's mission is to provide a high-quality environment for learning while fostering creativity and problem solving. Eagle Academy students are encouraged to work hard and dream big, which means they're in excellent company here at the National Summit. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand and join me in reciting the pledge with these young men and women who are coming. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, students. We're so happy that you were able to join us. And you all may be seated. So let me thank you again for being with us today. This past week has been a difficult one. ExcelinEd's founder and chairman, Governor Jeb Bush, lost his father, and our nation lost a great president. George Herbert Walker Bush lived a life of service, a life of purpose, which he instilled in those around him and especially in his family. That legacy is part of the reason why we're here today. Governor Bush wanted to make a difference, first in the lives of students in Florida, and now through this amazing community of partners, making a difference in the lives of families across our country. Governor Bush is with his own family this week, and I know he's appreciated the outpouring of prayers and respect for his father. It has been very meaningful for the Bush family. He did want to connect with us in some way, so earlier this week, he recorded a little message for you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Foundation for Excellence in Education's 2018 National Summit on Education Reform. To the more than 1,000 education leaders in the room, representing 47 states and Puerto Rico, I thank you for taking the time to be here this week. We have a really exciting 2 days in store for you. Regrettably, I won't be able to join you as my family and I lay our father to rest later today beside his beautiful bride of 73 years in their beloved College Station, Texas. He's the greatest man I'll ever know, And on behalf of my family, I sincerely thank you for the outpouring of well wishes and kind remembrances in the recent days. We are grateful beyond words. The reason ExcelinEd convened our inaugural summit 11 years ago was to serve as an exchange of cutting-edge ideas. Our goal was, and is, to enable reformers to share new ideas with colleagues and likewise expose them to the innovative efforts of their peers across the country. I'm hopeful and excited about the reform opportunities that are ours to seize in the coming months and years. I'm hopeful because we have a generation of leaders, a lot of them right here in this room, who are committed to tearing down the barriers to an education system innovative and adaptable enough to meet the unique needs of all students. I cannot overstate the urgency of our charge as education reformers. Earlier this year, the education reform community marked the 35th anniversary of the seminal A Nation at Risk report, the groundbreaking 5-alarm assessment of the failing state of our schools. 35 years later, our education system remains a threat to our nation. I thank you for embracing the challenge of transforming America's education system, but more importantly, I hope you embrace it with a rubber-meets-the-road urgency that is rare in policymaking today. Our country can't afford another 35 years of hyperbolic rhetoric that disguises real-life complacency. We can't afford 5 more years of it. I hope you come away from our summit introduced to all kinds of new ideas you can bring home with you, and I hope you in turn introduce them to your states, your cities, your districts, your schools, and your classrooms. And I hope you do it as quickly as you possibly can because our nation depends on it. On behalf of the board and the team at ExcelinEd, we look forward to supporting your efforts in every way possible in the coming year. Just remember, go big, be bold, and be impatient. God bless you all, and God bless our exceptional country. I'll see you next year in San Diego.
So nice to hear from him today. Sorry, I get a little teary there. I told Governor Bush that even though he won't be here with us, that his charge to us would not be unheeded, right? You all are going to go big and be bold. And with that kind of spirit, we are unstoppable. So knowing that he wouldn't be here this morning, Governor Bush personally reached out to someone who holds a lot of the same ideas and values as he does, and who has penned some really challenging and perceptive ideas about improving our nation. I'm talking about U.S. Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska. Senator Sasse has served as a college president and was elected to office in 2014. He believes that good policy thrives at the state and local level. In his book, The Vanishing American Adult, Senator Sasse describes how America's youth are not prepared to survive in our highly competitive global economy, which ultimately poses a threat to America's future. Like all of us here, he wants to see our young people become active and engaged citizens, and we know a quality education is part of that recipe. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Senator Ben Sasse.
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks to all of you for welcoming me. That was a great line from Governor Bush, wasn't it? About the way our rhetoric often disguises our complacency. It's a pretty great line about urgency. I'm excited to spend this time with you, and I'm also excited to see, as great as those Eagle Academy kids were, I'm excited to see we don't have any kids in the front row. I've still got shell shock from a couple of weeks ago in the run-up to the campaign. Pete Ricketts, who's my governor in Nebraska, and I got on a plane and we flew around Nebraska, and we were doing, kind of whistle-stop tours with state and local candidates across the state. And we do a weird thing in our house. We hybridize our schooling. I'm a first-time politician. I'm one of 8 people in the U.S. Senate who's never run for anything before in my life. And we had, when we were running, our daughters were 12, 10, and our boy was 2. So today we're 17, 15, and 7. And I didn't want to move them here. We don't want to raise our kids here. We can't figure out where they'd pull all the dead animals to the front stoop that my 7-year-old does every morning. And literally, we get some carcass at our front door like 6 or 7 days a week, and we don't have any cats, so it's my boy. So we didn't want to raise them here. And yet, I love my kids, and I don't want to be away from them all the time. So we take kids on the road with me. We live in Nebraska. I come back and forth to Monday to Friday work schedule every week. And I get home on Friday. My wife tells me which kid annoyed her most last week, and they become my date for the next week. So on Monday, somebody loads up on a plane. So when Governor Ricketts and I were flying around, I had my 7-year-old with me. And if you know Pete, he's bald. And when you're trying to climb on and off a little plane, you kind of bump each other a lot. And my kid accidentally regularly started rubbing the governor's head as he would climb into the back of the plane. And I realized ultimately this wasn't accidental. He wasn't tripping. He just thought it was like a genie move. And I'm telling my 7-year-old, you need to shape up. Like, you're the worst kid on this campaign tour. And then we got to the next city right after I told my 7-year-old it's time to man up and start to act a little more maturely. And we're about to make our series of speeches, and there's some mom in the front row at one of these speeches who's just so obviously exhausted, and I get it. You know, we had multiple kids at that stage one time, and her 12-month-old-ish kid is just learning to walk, just figuring it out. And the mom just sits down to be in an event that's warm and we're all inside, and she's just letting her 12-month-old sort of wander knee to knee to knee to knee. Kid can't walk yet, but can sort of toddle. But she forgot that the kid had a chocolate energy bar in his hand. And as he goes knee to knee to knee, he's melting this energy bar, just smearing it on the neighboring knees of all kids around. And I couldn't keep it together, and I never got my attention back on my speech. So I'm excited to be here, and you, please put away your chocolate energy bar. I'd like to do something today that at one level is just way too simple, but I want to talk about one distinction. But the reason I think it's essential is that if we talked about this distinction more often, I think it would transform almost all of our education reform debates in this country right now. And the distinction is this. You ready? I'm going to say something really, really profound. Education and schooling are not exactly the same thing. I wasn't looking for applause, but I'll take it. Schooling and education are not the same thing. Education is a goal. Schooling is one of many means to the end, or to that goal. And if we allow the debate to constantly imply that these two terms are synonyms, it means one of two things. It means either you can never reform and we have to be stuck with whatever model of schooling ever worked at one particular historical moment and we can never reform it or change it, or it means we don't believe in education or we don't love kids. Or, on the other hand, you're sort of buying into the idea that if you're for school reform or if you're for more diverse plural forms of educational delivery, that then the critics are right, and it means you education reformers are really just about undercutting public funding for schools. I don't think that's true. I've never actually met that boogeyman. When you're in this movement and you spend time with lots of people who care deeply about education reform, they're passionate about kids. We just tend to have some pluralistic debates about whether or not there's one form that is always the right form for every kid at every time and every place, for every form of educational preparation and every debate about what liberal arts should mean. And so I think it's really important that we do a better job of catechizing ourselves inside this movement about the distinction between education and schooling, and that we learn to tell that story publicly, because until we do, critics are going to be able to misrepresent a lot of what this movement's about and lead back to what Governor Bush called the laziness of rhetoric that masks our societal complacency about how many kids are being failed by the current educational system. I'd like to spend just a little bit of time on history and a little bit of time on the future. A little bit of reflection about how we got here, for good and for ill, and a little bit of reflection about the nature of the disruption that's coming upon us fast, and a little bit along the way about why we often seem so stuck and why we need not be so stuck. Lots of these problems are really fixable, but many of you are doing great things at the state and local level, and some of you are investing in national movement stuff. But as Governor Bush said, we can't wait 25 and 35 more years for the changes. There are a whole bunch of 7th graders in America that are 5 years from their graduation date, and there are a whole bunch of 2nd graders that are 10 years from their graduation date, and there are a lot of places in the country where kids are being left behind, and they ought not be. So first, a little bit of brief history. Our system is pretty strange, if you think about it. But like the old adage that a fish can't explain water to you because he's never not been in water, so often people involved in education, and I mean those who are less sympathetic to the education reform movement, often define education as schooling because we've not sufficiently stepped out to pull that fish out of water and reflect back on the difference between rivers and lakes and oceans and fresh water and salt water. Every day, millions of kids across America file into brick rooms where they sit in rows, sit still in rows, and they learn primarily only with people that had the accident of the exact same birth year, and they learn mostly by lecturing. Across human history, we've had recorded history for about 6,000 years. That's a really new thing, that you would have lots of kids from age 6 to 18, primarily just in a peer segregated environment with people exactly their same birth year, sitting still in 25 or 30 person rooms, learning mostly by lecture for most of their waking hours, 5 days a week. It's worked well for some, it works less well for others, but it's a product of a particular historical moment, and it's useful for us to say, this system wasn't ordained by God. There wasn't some moment where this form of educational delivery was inscribed on tablets and delivered to the ugly architecture over at the US Department of Education in Washington, D.C. It wasn't the case that Horace Mann heard trumpets or saw a bright light. And we should be able to acknowledge that the modal form of educational delivery for elementary and secondary education kids in America is a Prussian form of education from 150 years ago. That's not a form of derision. Ethnically, I think I'm Prussian. So this is not meant to be some direct, harsh critique on the system, but we should recognize that the form of public education that we have in this country is a product of a very particular moment. And in particular, the adoption, the American adoption of this German model of schooling happened because of two big historical disruptions that are different than the kind of disruptions we're living through now. The first disruption, the first response, was mass urbanization. The American population was 85% rural at the end of the Civil War. It would be only 40% rural 75 years later at World War II. That's significant. There were high school graduates. The high school as we know it now kind of existed before the Civil War, but less than 2% of people graduated from it. So if you were a 16-year-old kid in New Hampshire or in Virginia in 1855, it's more than 98% likely that you were, by age 17 or 18, almost entirely engaged in the thing that would become your lifelong calling. After the Civil War, though, swarms of people, and especially boys, moved into cities and were taking advantage of the industrial boom, the Industrial Revolution as it would come to American urban environments. That was coupled with a second major disruption, which was mass immigration. More than 25 million Europeans between the years of 1880 and 1924, so only 40 years, 25 million Italians, Greeks, Germans, Jews, Irish, flooded across the Atlantic Ocean into American cities. And to put into context how big that wave of immigration was over those 40 years, there were only 25 million people in America in 1850. In 1850, there were 25 million Americans. Between 1880 and 1920, 25 million immigrants would come. There were some pretty obvious and understandable worries about whether that many people coming that quickly from that many different cultures, many of them with no historic connections to the folks who lived in the now United States at that point, would be assimilated well. And so with all these different people, many of them coming to work in factories and plants and not necessarily having a full sense of the American civic traditions, they decided that schooling was necessary as a model that could be done at scale. Again, urbanization and industrialization and mass immigration over that period created the modern high school that we've inherited as if it's the only tool that could ever be used. But it was a tool that was being adopted in America on purpose because a particular set of problems were there. The rough and tumble of the new cities were really unhospitable for many different people. It worked for some. I want to be clear, the earliest wave of that mass secondary schooling building wave worked for some. But it didn't work for everybody. Lots of sons and daughters, either formerly from the countryside or from Irish immigrant communities, when they got to the US, lots of sons and daughters bottomed out quickly in New York and in Baltimore and in Chicago and Boston. rates of crime and prostitution and teenage drug use spiked. We remember Prohibition now as a woolly-headed social experiment, and to be clear, it was a bad idea, it was a bad solution, but we should back up and say historically, how was it the case that 85% of Americans, we didn't have good polling then, but to pass a constitutional amendment in the way that they did, the Volcker Act from 1919 to 1933, probably 85% of Americans were on board with Prohibition. Why did that happen? It's useful to remember that if you were walking down a street in Manhattan in the year 1900, you very literally probably had to step over drunk 13-year-old passed out Irish kids. And so the schooling movement was partly a solution to a particular set of problems. The progressive movement that emerged in large part in response thought that mass schooling was the most important institutional way that America would respond to this crisis of teenage X, Y, and Z, you name your problem. The young men and women who were crowding into the streets needed to be solved. They needed to be moved off the streets in the eyes of the reformers, and schooling was that solution. And the result was this massive push that largely worked for the industrial era moment in which they lived. Public high school enrollment in the US doubled from 1890 to 1900. It doubled again from 1900 to 1910. It doubled again in the next decade, and it doubled a fourth time leading up to 1930, such that the mass experience of almost every 14 to 17-year-old kid by the rise of World War II was they were in school, and 80% of people would become high school graduates by the end of World War II. Again, it was 2% in 1870. It becomes 80% graduates by 1940. Urban schools began to look like the institutions that we know today. Students age segregated with curricula focused on practical skills and job training, and by 1918, every state in the Union would have passed a compulsory school attendance law, and many states had a rule that you could terminate parental rights for truancy. If parents wouldn't send their kids to school, the state might take their kids away. Some of the motives for this movement were genuinely altruistic. I've got lots of problems with the progressive era movements, but some of them were altruistic. But many of these early 20th century reformers also had a secondary motive, which was social control. Again, there's no white hats and black hats simple way to tell the story. Some good stuff and some bad stuff came from the movement, but what's necessary for education reformers today is to be able to see it as a particular movement responding to particular problems, building a particular kind of institutional form that might just not fit our moment perfectly. A lot of what might be necessary in education reform is to say, hey, wait a minute. We've inherited a system of a kind of factory model secondary education system that was created in response to a bunch of problems. I submit to you that if all those folks were here today, they probably would propose different solutions to our problems, and yet we passively imply that their tool is not just the right tool, it's the only tool that any of us should be debating. I think our visions are too narrow. You don't need to look any further to understand the particular motives of some of these reformers than to look at John Dewey. John Dewey was an enormously important person in lots of domains of American life. He built a whole bunch of intellectual societies. He was a pragmatic philosopher. But most importantly, John Dewey was an educational reformer in his time, and his influence continues to shape American educational policy today. And his overriding lifelong goal was to create a mass system of secondary education that would be homogeneous. I think that was a mistake, but we should all, whether you want to be a Dewey champion today or you want to be a Dewey critic, we all ought to be able to see Dewey because he's everywhere. His main goal in creating mass education, mass secondary education, was part of a larger project. And that larger project was to crowd out the roles and responsibilities of traditional communities in America. Dewey was very scared about Catholic parents having too much influence on their kids, and he didn't think that Catholics were going to become fully American unless you could lessen the influence of the parents. And so one of Dewey's major goals was to replace familial nurture with state-run institutional nurture that would serve, in his view, larger state purposes. In his vision, in Dewey's vision, the purpose of the school was not to support parents, but to replace parents. The school, in his view, was to be wholly responsible for nurture. From sewing to cooking to philosophical and ethical training, Dewey believed that the school should be not just the primary, but almost the exclusive influence in the upbringing of children. He wrote a book in 1897 called The Pedagogic Creed. In the middle of his career, this is at the heart of his vision casting about homogeneous secondary education, and he never mentioned any other institution besides the school. It was a pedagogic creed about how American kids should be brought up, and there are no players in the entire book that wouldn't be a candidate for membership in a teachers' union. There were no parents, there was no Little League, there were no synagogues or churches, there was just the school. He wanted to build a factory so that capital S society could use, he wanted to build factories that society could use to manufacture the kind of people he thought were best suited for the industrial era. He had almost no room for the uniqueness of individuals and for the full flowering of human potential. The criteria for how a child would be educated well would be how well they were absorbed into the collective. Here's one of his seminal statements. All education proceeds by the participation of the individual in the larger social consciousness of the race. For Dewey, the grand march forward of that capital S society was the most important thing, and the individual was to become a loyal, orderly marcher. You, individual student, don't matter as an individual. You matter if you can march in line. And education, for Dewey, was not to be determined by your church or your family or your neighborhood or your local community. For Dewey, it was, can you fit into the industrial economy? If we want to understand American education today, and again, if you're a zealous reformer, as I know that most of you are and as I am, or if we have lots of friends who are defenders of the traditional system, we should all be able to at least rise to the debate of saying the model of homogeneous schooling that we have now is mostly built for an era where people assumed you were going to have lifelong employment on one factory line. I've decided not to go into a litany here in the interest of time, and also because you all know the data better than I do. I'm not going to go into a litany of what doesn't work and what does work in American schooling, because there's a lot to be put on both sides of the ledger, but I do just want to name one stat. And this isn't narrowly about educational outcomes, but it is about where education leads. Nick Eberstadt has a book called Men Without Work that I would highly recommend to you. Since 1965, we've had a tripling in the US of labor force non-participation by able-bodied males between the ages of 21 and 65. Between the ages of 21 and 65, 3 times as many able-bodied men no longer work. It's not because they're rich. They don't show up in the unemployment data because they've stopped looking for work. But there's something structurally wrong in that world. And some of it is when Dewey was writing, we were headed toward a world where industrial employment was going to grow forever. The high water mark of industrial employment in the US, the mid-1950s, 31% of American workers worked in a factory, and they were going to probably work in that factory, that one job, that one line for their whole life. Today, 7% of Americans work in big tool economy jobs, and it's going down, and it's going to go down forever. It's not chiefly because of trade. I'm a zealous free trader, but it's not chiefly because of trade. It's because of automation, which is just another way of saying humans are really smart, and humans figure out how to automate tasks that are routinizable. Dewey was building workers to do routinizable things. We live in an era of digital disruption where more and more routinizable things are going to be done by robots. And it probably means we need to be having a different conversation about homogeneous factory model schooling than was had at the beginning of this era, because we're at the end of that era. Obviously, I don't mean to suggest that principals and teachers around the country are huddled in little reading groups reading John Dewey, but we should understand that his spirit hovers over all of what's happening in American educational life today. And to begin to think about the transformation of the system begins with asking questions like, if the modern school was created because of the needs of the factory, at a time when the factories are largely dying, there's going to be really important industrial era work, but it's going to be mostly work of brain rather than brawn, we should be asking questions about factory model schooling. The second problem, of course, is that children are not widgets. They're souls. So there's a big debate we could have about whether or not our system is well aligned for the needs of the economy, but there's a bigger question, which is, are our children merely economic actors? They're not. They're souls. This is a big point that Dewey missed. education is not fundamentally about producing homogenized output. It is about forming and nurturing those little souls. Schools are not assembly lines, they're gardens. Done right, you're gardening when you're helping raise a kid because that kid's alive. And that child, that son or daughter, has a soul that's wanting to grow toward the sun, and you're nurturing it. You're not creating it ex nihilo as if you're God, and you're fashioning a child the way we fashion a widget. If we're going to understand what's going to happen next in American education, some of you think the whole system needs an overhaul, some of you think the system merely requires tweaks, but all of us are going to have to be able to engage more of our neighbors in these larger debates, and that requires admitting that education is an end. And in this country, too often we've talked about education only through debates about the means, which are schools. We in this movement have often not explained this well. We should distinguish more clearly between education funding and education management, because most of what most of you in this room really want to debate is about educational management and about institutional pluralization and about the kinds of people and the diverse kinds of people by skill set and life experience, and whether it's full-time or part-time, the kinds of people who should teach and shape and help nurture our kids, the scale of the school. My dad was a high school football and wrestling coach, Fremont Public High School, where I graduated. My wife is a former public school teacher, now mostly staying home to beat me up about which of the kids has to get back on the plane with me because she did better work educating 2 of them and I'm responsible for the bad behavior of the 3rd. But I love lots of teachers and administrators who've given themselves to this grand cause. That doesn't mean the only form of education is the 1,400-person public high school that I graduated from in Fremont, Nebraska. We need to get better at bringing our neighbors along into this debate, and we need to be constantly returning to and reorienting ourselves to that question of what it means to educate, because it is about growing and preparing and teaching our kids to empathize, and the new kinds of work that are coming in this digital revolution are going to require 35 and 40 and 45 and 50-year-olds to become lifelong learners. I think we'll rise to the occasion, but no civilization has ever done it before. So we should be aware of the magnitude of this challenge. When you're 40 and you're 45 and you get disrupted not only out of your job and out of your firm, but out of your industry, and you have to get prepared to do new stuff again, it's good that you have a soul rather than just that you were a well-programmed robot when you were 15, because we're going to need a new level of nimbleness and persistence and flexibility and grit in our kids, and that probably requires a different kind of preparation. There are bits of some of this healthy debate about different forms and different methods in the Montessori debates and in the Waldorf debates and in the South Beach debate. I kid, but there are so many debates about multiple intelligences that are getting at some of this, but it doesn't always get to the level of us thinking about institutional reform. Ultimately, so much of this goes back to Plato. It's tough for me as an Aristotle guy to admit this, but The Republic is probably the best book ever written on education. The Republic is about a whole lot of things. It's about government and justice and about music and about philosophy, but to say that it's about all those things is just another way of saying it's about education. And what's crucial about The Republic is the image of the philosopher, the teacher, the person who loves the student, whose soul is filled with the light and with the love of the truth, that reaches down to people, kids, who are still lost in darkness and tries to turn their soul around to be reoriented toward the good and the true and the beautiful, to be interested in the light. That, the Greek term that Plato uses, is actually translated as turning around. And that's what education is about. It's about being turned around from our self-centered narcissism that all of us have deep in our souls and being more interested in the broader world and all the potential that you have to live a life of gratitude, to love your neighbor. That's what education is. It's being turned around to a place of service. And that's what a great teacher does. We all know these teachers, right? I know one teacher who is a generation older than I am, but his sons I know well. And this guy, like my dad, wasn't in my school system, but he was a teacher and coach. And when kids would end up in trouble in their community, when a family fell apart, this guy would always just end up bringing more people home. There's the old Eddie Murphy joke, used to be your cousin, now he's your brother, shut up and move over. This family did that. This teacher did that. They brought some kids into their home, just 3 years and 6 years and 9 years later, as my friends were growing up, they would just constantly take somebody else home. Lots of teachers are not bringing other people home, but the kind of love that makes a good teacher looks a lot like the willingness to just bring people home. It's not about the 47 minutes till the next passing period and the specific quiz we're going to give. It's about something much broader, about nurturing those little souls. And we know that those teachers, those kinds of teachers, are everywhere, in every system, public and private, big and small, elementary and secondary. But we also know that the monolithic systems we have right now regularly prevent the great teachers from being able to reach to those deep levels, and they regularly prevent individual students from being able to encounter the teacher as more than somebody who's running just a little part of the assembly line in the course of the day. Frankly, I think that a lot of what we do in some of those homogenized institutions is quite literally soul-crushing. But it doesn't have to be that way. We've had this behemoth system for a long time. It works for some. It doesn't work for others. It's going to work less well over time for lots of our kids in an economy that's going to require a lot more nimbleness out of them. And we should use that as not just threat, but as opportunity for those broader debates. The founders had an understanding that a flourishing republic requires a knowledgeable citizenry, but the founders never thought that a knowledgeable citizenry depended on 12 years of state-mandated, state-run, homogenized schooling. They understood better than most of us do nowadays that education is much deeper than just schooling, and they knew that real teaching doesn't come in a one-size-fits-all package. There are many different ways to teach, and many different families and communities should be set free to experiment with more of that. Families and local communities should have the freedom to pursue different modes because the souls of our students require it. I'm a conservative, but I think that a lot of what we need in this moment is actually quite radical. In the best sense of that word. Radical comes from the Greek term radix. And thanks for letting me shoehorn just a little extra Greek into my history lesson today. The history PhD in my soul that my mom constantly says I've wasted. If I can give a speech and I can do a little bit of history of 19th century America, and I got to use a translated term, I'm calling my mom after this, and I'm going to tell her I get to check the history professor box. I didn't entirely waste the time. It is great to be able to be with you all today. I know that this room is filled with people who work tirelessly. One of the strangest experiences of being a first-time politician is that I regularly am traveling across Nebraska, and somebody my age or 10 years younger or 10 years older will come up to me and say, "Hey, are you Coach Sasse's kid?" And I'll say, "Yeah." They're like, "Could you tell him thanks for me? There was a time when I was in 8th grade, and I was in trouble with this, and he did that for me." Happens all the time. No one has ever thanked me for something particular my dad taught them in the classroom. They've thanked me for the way he loved them, for the way he cared about them, for the way he was there after class or after school or persuaded them to stop smoking in the parking lot and come back to the wrestling team. It's almost always the part that was about the nurture of broader souls, not just the facilitation through the textbook, as important as it is at us getting better at facilitating our kids through the right kinds of texts and passing the right kinds of exams that demonstrate their actual preparedness. But when we talk about education as souls, what we're really talking about is we're talking about love. Because at the end of the day, the thing that actually transforms our students' lives, the thing that makes parents invest in their kids is love. It's a parent's love that checks the homework. It's a parent's love that pulls extra shifts. It's a teacher's love that stays with their kids after class. It's a teacher's love that sticks with the big job and the small paycheck that passes that spark on to the next generation. It's love that brings neighbors together and builds an architecture for raising their kids. And it's love that motivates all of your innovation. We're at time, so I won't do it here, but I'd love to take time and riff together on George H.W. Bush's 1,000 Points of Light speech, because he was talking about you. He was talking about the kinds of people who know that at the end of the day, government maintains a framework for ordered liberty, but what that framework is about is creating contexts and communities in which that spark of love can be passed on to the next generation. I won't riff on it, but I will conclude by quoting him. This is George H.W. Bush in 1988 in New Orleans at the Republican National Convention. George H.W. Bush, on the eve of the general election campaign, "We are a nation of community, of thousands and tens of thousands of ethnic, religious, social, business, labor union, neighborhood, regional, and other types of organizations, all of them varied, voluntary, and unique. But this is America. It's the Knights of Columbus, the Grange, Hadassah, the Disabled American Veterans, the Order of Ahiba, the Business and Professional Women of America, the Union Hall, the Bible Study, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and Holy Name. It's a brilliant diversity that spreads like stars, like 1,000 points of light in a broad and peaceful sky. If you want a good description of America, it doesn't get much better than that, and that's what you're trying to do for your neighbors. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Please welcome author and co-founder of Echelon Insights, Kristen Soltis Anderson.
Hello.
Thank you, Senator. Well, thank you so much for joining us here at ExcelinEd 2018. First, you as a sitting senator have written multiple books while you have been a member of the US Senate. So obviously books are very important to you. When you were young, what books most inspired you?
So when you're from Nebraska, football's the second most important religion in our state. And so I started reading the paper before I started reading books because I wanted to find out, the latest stats on Husker recruiting every morning. And my dad set a requirement that you couldn't turn to the sports page until you'd read one article on the front page and one article on the opinion page. And when you'd read those two, which I had no interest in, then I could get to what I cared about, which was sports. And then ultimately that inspired a lot of interest. But we recently reread The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe at our house, my 7-year-old and I, and it reminded me that that was a pretty formative book for me.
So the most recent book is Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. Just came out, I believe, a couple weeks ago. Yeah. Focused on trying to understand this really divisive moment we're in America. Can schools play a role in building that sense of community, rebuilding some of those ties, addressing this sort of crisis of loneliness that we're facing in this country?
They can, and I think they have to. I think what's going on in the country right now is we've inverted our sense of attachments and relationships and community. And so political identities are flooding in to fill the void of the collapse of local America. I think one of the most basic things the digital revolution is doing, for good and for ill, is that, I don't have an iPhone, I was going to pull out my iPhone. This tool has given us the freedom to be placeless. We all know far more people that we pretend we're friends with that are from faraway places, but statistically, people have much thinner relationships at home. There's been a halving of friendship in America in the last 25 years. We've gone from 3.2 friends in 1990 per American to 1.8 today, and yet people think by going from 200 to 500 social media friends on Facebook that they're going to be happier. There's no data that shows you get happier going from 200 to 500 social media friends, but you're happier if you have neighbors to love and serve, and I think the local school is one of the institutions that people have to re-engage, because until we rebuild that institutional texture, we're going to have more of this fragmentation that leads to othering and screaming about them at a distant political level. And the neighbors that actually need you are neighbors down the street. So I think re-engaging at the school is not just an opportunity, it's a mandate.
The other book that you've written is The Vanishing American Adult, stemming from your experience as a college president. You're a bit critical of my generation, the millennial generation. Walk me through a little bit about what you think's wrong with us, and then I'll challenge you on what I think's right.
So first of all, let's just talk about what's wrong with you. Let's let the generation go, but I know you well enough that your football loyalties are just completely misaligned.
Go Gators. Go Gators.
The best team money can buy. That's going to get me in trouble. Can we edit the tape? Can we back up? I regret that. I request that my words be taken down. There are like 15 football programs more controversial than the University of Florida's right now.
I
love that she just admitted she's in a top 20 controversial program. That's what I heard. First of all, my critique is actually not of the millennial generation. The Vanishing American Adult is talking about the fact that for the first time in human history, we have lots of people coming of age who don't have an experiential understanding of the distinction between production and consumption. That's not a blame point. That's a historical and economic point to make. But if I was going to blame anybody, I'd blame the parents and the grandparents, not millennials. But functionally, one of the things that I became a college president at age 37, and I was often mistaken for a student. Washington has aged me now. But 10 years ago, I looked a lot younger. And I thought of myself as not generationally divided from our student population, but I realized quickly in my time there that experientially, I didn't know anybody when I went away to college in my ag manufacturing, working class town, or when I went away to school in Boston. Everybody I knew in my high school and everybody I knew when I got to college in 1990 had done some formative work experience when they were a teenager. And when I got to be a college president a decade ago, I found that the overwhelming majority of our incoming students had never actually done any work. That's not a fault point to make. It's simply saying that we don't have labor near the household the way that we used to. And so in Nebraska, a lot of our kids still do get bussed out, as I did as a kid, to walk beans, and we don't walk beans anymore, but to detassel corn. But across the country, by and large, students don't have any experience of the production side of the equation. And here's why that's really important. It turns out if you don't know what production means, you're probably not going to be happy. Because statistically, people are made happy by work. Consumption is mainly a means to the end of being able to get back to vocation, get back to work, loving your neighbor. You're satisfied by having a meaningful calling. You're not satisfied by consuming more stuff. And in the data, again, I'm a historian by training and a business strategy guy by work history, so I'm not a sociologist, but I've been reading a lot of sociology the last 3 or 4 years. In the data, it's pretty clear that we are simultaneously the richest people in all of human history, and I don't mean just the 1%, I mean middle-class Americans are the richest people in all of human history, and yet we have a lot of existential angst, and this is going to be the 3rd consecutive year of decreasing life expectancy in the US. We are literally killing ourselves by deaths of despair. Suicides, opioids, and other forms of overdose are now vastly outdistancing car accident deaths, which were the #1 driver of mortality or death per year in the US from 85 years ago till 5 years ago. And now we have something really different happening, and I think a lot of that is related to a lack of community and a lack of calling.
So you talked a lot about what we should or should not be expecting out of our schools and how schooling is not necessarily the same as education. I have a new survey that's just out today. I did a project studying millennial parents with the Walton Family Foundation, and we asked millennial parents who have kids in the public schools, what do you expect out of these schools? What do you expect the school will do versus what do you expect you as a parent will do? And even things like preparing your child to be able to understand a lease document are things that they expect the school to be playing a pretty significant role in doing. They want schools to prepare kids socially, emotionally, workforce and life skills, as well as the core academics. Should these young parents be expecting schools to do all of these things? And if so, what do we need to change about our schools to be able to provide that?
Yeah, I think the short answer has to be no. That parents who think anything you can itemize as a need for your kids is something that can be pushed off to the school. I think that's just a wrong way to think about the problem. Obviously, not every kid is going to come from a background where they're going to have a stable home environment. And statistically, the crisis of the nuclear family, I think, is the most important issue in America, bigger than policy, but also at a policy level. I'm a quite conservative guy by voting record, but I sit in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's desk on purpose on the Senate floor for 2 reasons. Number one, he's the author of the famous quote, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. We need a lot more sense of shared facts and shared problematizing before we get to fighting about policy solutions right now. But the other thing is that Moynihan wrote the report in the mid-1960s about the crisis in the black family. And at that point, out-of-wedlock birth rates in America were 6% overall, but they hit between 22 and 24% in the black community at that time. Today, disaggregate it all, you don't have to think about the racial components at all. In every community in America, there is a crisis of fatherlessness. And when you talk to teachers and principals in your local school, there's no more significant driver of educational challenges in the schools than folks that don't have a dad. And 59% of babies born to women under age 30 now in America have no meaningful connection to baby's dad. That is a crisis, and that isn't going to be fixed by any institution. That's going to require an entire societal and cultural conversation about what's happening in the neighborhood, all of our neighborhoods, around the school. The school has to be a tool where we, and I don't think we, Washington, D.C., can solve it for 320 million Americans, but I think we in every neighborhood have to debate what is the problem set that the local school should be tackling for us, but it can't be everything, because if it tries to be everything, it will do nothing well.
So you, as a historian, you know just how fast the world is changing in this particular moment, even compared to past times where we've had big economic disruption. This is all unfolding very quickly. The schools haven't necessarily kept up. But when I do focus groups and talk to parents, a lot of times they can feel frustrated with what sometimes feels like flavor of the month experimentation in education reform, that they feel like things actually are changing quite a lot in their kids' schools, that every year there's something different. What are things that those who care about education reform can do to better reach parents about the importance of really trying to reshape this system? Because change can be hard. People can say, well, I was schooled one way, why is it so different for my kid? I can't help them with their math homework. What's a good message for ed reformers to parents who are apprehensive about this change?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I would be consulting lots of people in your room on an important question like that. But I think it is important for parents to be situated in the context of the digital revolution through which we're living. Because they know that it's only 11 years ago that the iPhone was introduced and faster download speeds, and it's transformed almost all of American community life. And inevitably, for good and for ill, it's going to transform where education heads. And I think parents know instinctively that the water over the rock effects of where you spend your time change who your kids are. Many of us know Moore's Law when you think about buying a cheap laptop, right? Moore's Law is the idea that if you go to Best Buy, you can get twice as fast, with twice as much storage power, a laptop every 24 months for half the price. But Moore's Law is much more than that. Moore's Law is really the shape of the curve of technological change. And there's a Moore's Law coming to neurobiology right now. And imaging of the brain is leading us, we've learned more about the human brain in the last 19 months than in all of human history combined until 19 months ago. And one of the things we're learning is that the frontal lobe isn't done at puberty. For girls, the frontal lobe is probably not done until 3 or 4 or 5 years after puberty. For males, it's arguably never, the frontal lobe is arguably never done. But it's at least late 20s. The neural imaging would say that the full executive function of making long-term rational decisions for males is not there at 25 yet. It's still forming. If some moron passes you on the interstate at 110 miles today, at 110 miles an hour, it's a male and he's under 25. Statistically, it's like 99.9% likely. That's because of something that actually is happening in the brain. And I think that parents have an intuitive sense of this. I believe that the technology saturation of the way we're living life right now, or the way we've lived it the last 10 years, 50 years from now, we're going to look back and think that this is as weird as when people would let their kids smoke and think nothing of it. Right? The speed of technological change is going to change the economy in ways that are both good and bad, mostly good. There's going to be more total economic output than anybody in all of human history has ever imagined. But it's not clear that it's going to redound to the median worker. So we need to have big societal conversations about the digital revolution economically. But the digital revolution socially and culturally is clearly transforming childhood. And I think parents know that. And so for me, that becomes a starting point to think about, what is school doing well? What is it doing poorly? How is schooling going to change? How should it change? You see more and more schools now gathering up phones when kids arrive at 8 a.m. And what's interesting, this is an experiment that started a year and a half ago, right? We're 17, 18 months into schools taking away phones for the day. What you find is most kids in the survey data hated it at first, and now they've actually come to like it. It's sort of begrudging, so you're the expert on polling, but you have to ask the questions the right way. But when there are 6 kids sitting around a lunch table and 5 of the 6 are on their phone, the 6th kid has to be on their phone too, because if they're not, they're sending a signal, there's nobody who wants me. There's nobody who wants to talk to me anywhere else. You all have more important things to do than be here with me. So I have to signal that I have more important things to do as well. But it becomes a collective action problem that 6 kids never actually sit together in the moment, and they want that.
Well, I'm grateful that I had an opportunity to talk to you without a screen in front of my face. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really enlightening. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Patricia Levesque.
Thank you, Senator Sasse and Kristen, for getting us off to a great start. You know, you may not know this, but we start thinking about the ideas and planning for the next summit as soon as the close of lunch tomorrow. And so I heard a lot of things this morning from Senator Sasse that make me think we should dig in next year in San Diego on rethinking schooling. So we're going to do some research on that for you. To get the most out of the next 2 days, I have a few logistical notes and tips to share. First, I strongly encourage you to download the National Summit event app. We don't have it up there. The app will provide you with detailed information on schedules, speakers, maps for where the sessions are. You can share your event experiences on social media using hashtag EIE18. Instructions on how to download the app are on page 3 of your program booklet. I also want to thank our summit sponsors and our donors who help us do the work throughout the year where we serve you in your state. This summit and our policy work across the country could not happen without you. Thank you so much. In between sessions, please take time to stop by an education space and expo. If you go out the doors here, it's to your right in Salon 10. Now, this is the place for you to charge your phones. It's the place for photo opportunities, to connect with fellow attendees, and also to pick up a free book that we have for you. Coming up in the next few minutes, we're going to have a block of strategy sessions. They're all on this same floor beginning at 10 a.m. At lunch, we are going to hear from celebrated author Chip Heath. His most recent book, The Power of Moments, Why Certain Experiences Have Extraordinary Impact, is a New York Times and a Wall Street Journal bestseller. This is the only session of our summit that will not be recorded and it will not be live streamed. So if you're not in the room, you will miss it. Please be here. It is a copy of his book, Dr. Heath's book, that we have a free version of for you in the education space and expo. So please stop by and pick it up. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful start. You're dismissed.